Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar session. Today's session is an attendee choice webinar, which is an annual event where we allow anyone who has attended a webinar in the current calendar year to vote on a list of topics. Today's topic is what employee notices are required and when. Our presenter is Laura Bibb, Senior Compliance Counsel for Pro Benefits, and Laura will take over in just one moment. Again, thank you for joining today. We hope that you can hear clearly. If you cannot, you may want to switch back from either your computer speakers or the phone, one of the two. Keep in mind, we're always dependent on the quality internet connection, but hope you can hear clearly. During or after the session, your questions are welcome. The best place to submit a question during the session is through the question box on the control panel, which will come directly to our team. And if we don't get your question answered during the session, we'll follow up with you. Similarly, you are welcome always to email our team at compliance@probenefits.com. Thank you for attending the session today. And with that, I turn it over to Laura.
Thank you. I just want to mention some resources we have right before we get started, just to take a moment to remind you about the availability of these resources to you. First, we do maintain a list of FAQs on our website, probenefits.com, for both plan participants and employer and advisor partners. So if you have any questions, that's always a good resource, especially for the COVID guidance and extensions that we've experienced recently. We also have our recent webinars available to you all for viewing. You can view the prior webinars online if you're looking for more information. We also have educational and training materials available upon request for a variety of topics. If there's anything in particular that you need, feel free to reach out to us. We also have the mobile app that I want to remind you of. This is a wonderful app, provides easy account access for participants. Would encourage you and your participants, if you haven't checked that out, to do so. And then also make sure you follow us on social media. We've got our social media tags there. We put out helpful information, and we also have several giveaways for our followers, including gift cards and other prizes. So make sure that you check that out. Finally, our team is here to assist you every day in whatever way we can. We have great folks on staff, and we're here to assist you. So feel free to reach out to us either by email or a phone call, and we'd love to help you in the way we can. Before we get started on our topic today, I did want to let you know that for everyone that completed the topic survey to help choose today's webinar, we chose 2 winners at random to receive a $50 Amazon card. So you should receive, if you haven't already, an email notification if you are a winner. But this is our annual attendee choice. Each year in the third quarter of the year, we send you a short survey asking for you all to select the topic. Generally, we're selecting topics based on current events or current regulations, but this is a webinar where you all actually voted and got to select what we're talking about today. So thank you to everyone who took the time to vote. We really appreciate that. The topic today ultimately was the winner, but you can see here based on the survey results, there was lots of interest in other topics. I'm very close between this topic and a review of the Section 125 Basics. So we will certainly keep these topics in mind and this feedback that you've provided us in mind as we plan our future webinar calendar for this year and for next year, to make sure that we're highlighting the topics that you all want to hear about. So today we are talking about disclosures, what's required and when. And one of the most common questions we get about disclosures is, do you have a list of everything that we're required to provide to employees? Unfortunately, There is not a one-size-fits-all list. That would be great for both advisors and employers if there was such a thing that existed. But there are some good resources, and we're going to take a look at three of those today. But since isn't a one-size-fits-all, we really have to look at what plans the employer sponsors and the size of the employer and sometimes the funding. So if you're self-funded, there may be certain requirements that apply, and vice versa. If they're fully insured plans, there may be requirements that apply there. But generally, the employer as a plan sponsor has an obligation to both communicate required communications to participants and sometimes employees generally, but also to administer the plan as written. And there are three ways which an employer can fulfill its obligations to administer the plan as written and to provide certain disclosures to participants and employees. The first of these is the summary plan description. And this is really the primary vehicle for employers to communicate to participants about their rights and benefits under the plan. It's, in essence, it's the plan in writing. Under ERISA, the SPD must be furnished within 90 days after a participant begins or becomes covered under the plan. So oftentimes the SPD may include some of the required disclosures and notices that we're going to take a look at in the resources that we have for you today. So that's one consideration for an employer is, one, are these disclosures included in this SPD document? And two, should they be included? There's some notices that the employer may want to send separately as standalone notices. But with all of the COVID changes and COVID extensions that we've experienced lately, the SPD may be a good way for employers to communicate some of these disclosures that are required to employees. While the COVID extensions aren't required to be communicated, it certainly is helpful information for our employees and our participants. And since the SPD isn't required to be provided every year unless there's a change, this year may be a good year to really take a look at that SPD and see if what notices and disclosures you can check off the list by including them in the SPD, especially if you're going to be updating that based on the COVID extension. The second method here is the summary of benefits and coverage. And this is a requirement that was added by the ACA. It is a condensed summary of participants' rights and benefits, but only applies to health plans that are subject to the ACA. So this is another way that an employer as a plan sponsor is communicating about benefits and rights to participants specifically for the health plan. So if there are notices and disclosures that are not addressed in the SPD or the SBC, then those notices and disclosures have to be provided, if they're required to be provided for that employer, by separate standalone notices. And this can be done on a one-by-one basis, or they can be grouped together either by hard copy or electronically. We're going to discuss electronic disclosures a little bit later. But there's some notices, as you will see when we look at these resources, that have to be provided to all employees. For example, the CHIPRA notice has to be provided to all employees regardless of whether they are actually enrolled in an employer's plan or not. So depending on how the employer distributes the SPD, the employer may not be providing the SPD to all employees, because generally that is a hefty document. It's not a short document. So that may be a document that is only provided to participants. So if that's the case, the employer may need to provide the CHIPRA notice as a standalone notice. So that's just one example of when an employer might utilize the standalone notices Another example is Medicare Part D credible coverage notices. And these sometimes may be included in the SPD, but this is an annual notice requirement that is only provided to Part D eligible individuals. So an employer may decide that it's better suited to send that notice to those Part D eligible individuals, really because of the importance of those folks knowing whether their coverage is credible or not, and making decisions about whether to enroll in Medicare Part D. And again, one of the other common questions we get when we start talking about using an SPD as a means to provide notices and disclosures is, what do we mean by SPD? And ERISA requires that plans have an SPD. There's certain content requirements outlined in ERISA about what specifically must be included. And for some employers, this means that they are relying on the carrier booklet. And carrier booklets are generally substantially compliant, but they can be missing some items. For other employers, it may mean that they have what we refer to as a wrap SPD or a wraparound SPD. And this is generally used for two purposes. One, to supplement the carrier booklet, and also if the employer is subject to Form 5500 filing requirements, to consolidate all of those multiple plans under a single consolidated plan for filing purposes. So again, the SPD is the primary vehicle about how we're going to communicate with participants about their rights and benefits. It can be a means for providing some of the disclosures we're going to look at, but it is necessary for the employer to check the timing requirements. So does the timing of when the notice needs to be required mesh with when you are actually providing this SPD? And again, there may be some notices that you will want to provide outside of the SPD. So I mentioned that there's really not a one-size-fits-all approach to this, but when we are looking at the issue of disclosures and notice requirements, we typically use three resources, and we're happy to share these with you. As a reminder, after the webinar, we're going to be sending out a recording of the webinar along with slides. And if you are interested in any one of these three resources, you can respond and let us know, and we can provide those to you. But the first is the Department of Labor Reporting and Disclosure Guide. The great thing about this guide is that it is available online. So you can actually Google DOL Reporting and Disclosure Guide, and it will pop up for you. Another great aspect of this guide is it comes straight from the government. It comes straight from the Department of Labor. It was last updated, as you'll see, in 2017. It is 30 pages, so I will warn you before you hop into this, that it is quite lengthy, but it does provide health and welfare as well as retirement disclosure. So it is a fully comprehensive guide for employers who have health and welfare plans as well as retirement plans. There is a lot of information, as you can see. Some of these may or may not apply, but you'll see that they've listed them in chart format based on the type of notice or disclosure, as well as information about to whom the disclosure should be provided to and when. So you see the first document here is the SPD. We've also got the SMM. And then the third document that they refer to is a summary annual report. Again, this is an instance where this may or may not apply to an employer, depending on whether they are subject to the Form 5500 filing requirements. On the next page, we've got the COBRA notices, and you see that there are several notices here, and we are COBRA administrators, so these are notices that we are very familiar with. But there's more information here for you if you're interested in taking a look at that. And again, here's the chipper notice that I mentioned. And as you can see in the to whom column, it does say all employees regardless of enrollment or eligibility status. So this is a good example of a notice that you might, as an employer, you might want to send separately. So this is our first resource, the 30-page DOL reporting and disclosure guide. The second resource that we use is a reference document. It's approximately 20 pages long. It is from EBIA, which is our trusted legal resource. This is not readily available like the DOL reporting and disclosure guide. We actually have a subscription, but this is a great resource as well. It provides a little bit more explanation and information, as you'll see in just a minute. But EBIA uses attorney authors known as industry experts across the country. So this is also a great resource if you're looking for additional information or explanation outside of the DOL reporting and disclosure guide. So you can see here that they talk about the SPD and what's required to be included in the SPD, and certain mandates that may be already included in the SPD by virtue of ERISA requirements. And then if we keep scrolling, there's also a checklist in this resource that is very helpful because it provides information on disclosures and notices that may not be included in the SPD or the SBC. So another great resource for employers and advisors, and you can see here, this is the section providing more information about the SBC requirements and things that would need to be addressed in that particular disclosure. And then here we have the checklist of required participant disclosures other than in the SPD and the SBC. So we get into the list here of those potential disclosures that may or may not be included in your SPD. And some of these may be included depending on the type of benefit. But it's a great reminder of things to make sure that you've looked at to make sure whether they actually are included in your SPD, and if not, whether you need to address them on a separate standalone basis. So for instance, here we've got the FMLA leave. Often there is mention in the SPD of how FMLA impacts benefits, but those specific FMLA notices might not actually be in your SPD. So if you're an employer who's subject to FMLA, you may have notice requirements outside of the information that's in your SPD. So the third and final resource we're going to take a look at is a list that we have compiled of potential notices by distribution date. So the other resources have provided information more in, I would say, a checklist format. The DOL guide does contain information about when those notices need to be provided. But what we've tried to do here is put together a list and group the disclosures and notices based on when they actually have to be provided. So the things that are in italics are things that we have identified that are often contained in the SPD. So they may not need to be provided separately. But you can see here we've broken them down by initial hire or upon hire, upon initial enrollment or eligibility for the plan. So a great example there, we talked about previously the summary plan description. which has to be provided within 90 days of enrollment. We also have the COBRA initial notice there. This is the notice that if the employer is subject to COBRA and if the benefit is a COBRA eligible benefit, this notice must be sent to participants upon initial enrollment. So sometimes that's referred to as a general COBRA notice, but it's a notice that needs to go out explaining the COBRA rights. The next section are notices that have to be sent annually. The first notice there, you'll recognize the SBC that we've already talked about is a requirement under the ACA for health plans. This notice has to be sent annually, along with the Medicare Part D notice. And I will note that this Medicare Part D notice was required October 15th. If you have missed that deadline and are now realizing that, I would just suggest to you that you go ahead and work on getting those out as soon as you can. So that Medicare Part D notice is an annual notice requirement due October 15th each year. The next category of notices that we've got here are notices that are required upon a specific event. So these aren't notices necessarily that are sent on an annual basis or upon enrollment, but these are notices that are not required until something happens. And when that event happens, the employer's responsibility to send the disclosure of the notice is triggered. The example here that I'd like to refer you to is the COBRA election notice. This is one that we're all familiar with, especially if you're subject to COBRA. But generally, once a participant has a qualifying event, that is what triggers the requirement to send the COBRA election notice within 44 days. The good news is if you're using a plan service provider, the provider is doing that for you. So they are sending the COBRA election notice for you. As a COBRA administrator, that is something that we are doing on behalf of our COBRA clients, as well as the other required COBRA disclosures. But if you're self-administering, this would be a responsibility that would be on you as the employer, as the plan sponsor. So that's going to be something you will want to consider as you're considering whether to self-administer. The first two notices here are also things that you may want to consider if you're trying to decide whether to self-administer. And these are communications and notices and disclosures that deal with benefit determination. So an initial benefit determination when a participant has a claim, whether that claim is approved or denied. And then the second bullet are the internal claims and appeals and external review notices if a claim is denied, giving the participant information about their rights to appeal and how to go about doing that. So these notices here are all notices, again, that are triggered by a certain specific event. And again, the notices that are in italics are generally those things that are included in the SPD. The last notices or group of notices are general or specific notices or postings. And these are things that typically are not included in the SPD, and the employer is generally not going to be addressing in the SPD. They may be notices or requirements that you are posting in your workplace as part of your posting requirements. So those are the three resources, again, that we use, that we refer to when we are looking at the question of what disclosures are required and when. We're, again, happy to provide you with copies of those after the presentation, if any of those would be helpful to you. And again, as a reminder, the DOL guide is available online. You can Google that and it's readily available to you. I want to briefly talk about at a high level electronic disclosures. This is another common question we get about disclosure requirements is, can we send these things electronically, especially the SPD, because as I said, that is generally a larger document. And oftentimes employers are trying to be conscious of the cost of printing and the environmental impact of printing all that paper. So there is a way to send disclosures, both the SPD and other ERISA required disclosures, electronically. I do want to note that there were final regs issued for retirement plans early summer of 2020, back in May, which seems like a very long time ago, but it actually wasn't quite that long ago. But those final regulations addressed only retirement plan electronic disclosures. So it's slightly different now than the health and welfare plan. So those of you with retirement plans, you may have heard about those final regulations from your advisor who's assisting you with the retirement plan and helping you with those disclosure requirements. But just know that the welfare plans are not covered by those regulations. These welfare plans still fall under the 2002 safe harbor that's been in place that we are familiar with. So there are a wide variety of means that you can use to provide electronic disclosures, including email, your company website, DVD, etc. There's no prescriptive means that you have to use to provide them. And again, it is a way that you can provide these ERISA required documents and disclosures. You must, however, provide notice each time an electronic disclosure is made, whether you're making it by email, your company website. It has to be a prominent notice to the participant that you have sent something electronically, and it must include the right to request a paper copy. And if someone requests a paper copy, you must provide that upon request. There is a distinction with respect to electronic disclosures for employees who have work-related computer access versus those who don't have work-related computer access. If the employee has work-related access, and this includes if you still have employees who are working from home and they have a laptop that they're using to do their work, that would also apply. You can go ahead and comply with the safe harbor for sending electronic disclosures. If the employee does not have access to a work-related computer, you can still provide disclosures electronically, but you have to obtain the employee's consent to do so. Part of that consent is getting information to it, especially if you're providing the documents via email. You would need to obtain, as part of that consent, a proper email address from the employee. So it's still something that you can do. If the employee doesn't have work-related computer, there's just one extra step that you will need to do to get their consent. And then if they don't consent, then you would need to provide those disclosures and documents via paper copy. So posting them somewhere in your workplace or laying them out on the table if you actually have a physical break room is not going to be sufficient. You're going to have to distribute them via paper copy. And I know we've talked a lot today about disclosures. I don't want us to forget about the reporting obligations. I'm not going to talk about these in great detail. We have, for many of these, we have resource materials available online. We also have webinars, but I just want to remind you of these requirements. The Form 5500, the requirement to include healthcare costs in your W-2, since W-2 season will fast be upon us. The P-Corps fees are reported with Form 720, that was due back in the summer, and then your 1094, 1095 forms. And just remember that there are significant penalties often associated with reporting failures. So make sure as you're thinking through your disclosure requirements that you're also thinking about any reporting obligations that you may have as an employer. So finally, just wanted to leave you with some best practices to consider when you're looking at what disclosures you may be required to provide, and how and when to provide those. The first thing is to make sure that you have an SPD. Make sure that you have one in place, that it is compliant. Again, it's not required to be provided every year, but it can be a great tool to meet some of the disclosure requirements. And this year, as I mentioned, with all of the COVID extensions, many employers may be providing additional information or providing updated SPDs with that COVID extension information in it. So it may be a good year to try to tackle some of these disclosures using your SPD as the vehicle to do that. Again, there's no notice requirement for those COVID extensions, but certainly helpful information to provide to your employees and participants. Make sure that for health plans that you confirm that you have an SPD, or excuse me, SBC. This is again an annual requirement. If you have a fully insured plan, the carrier is doing this on your behalf. But if you have a self-funded plan, you may need to address this requirement separately. And then assess your need for any separate notices beyond what's included in the SBC and the SPD. And this is going to be based on the plans that you sponsor and the whether the notices apply to you or not. And again, there may be notices that you can include in your SPD, like the chipper notice, but the timing may not work and the distribution may not work. Since that notice has to go to all employees, you may prefer to send that as a separate standalone notice versus sending an SPD to all your employees. And then finally, this is very important. Make sure that if you receive a request from a participant for any disclosure, SPD or any of the other notices, that you're providing that promptly via paper, even if you're doing it electronically, if there's a paper request. It's important to note that as an employer, you have 30 days to provide those documents upon request. And then after that 30-day period, the penalties for failure to provide begin to start. And those are $110 per day for each date that you don't respond. So it's really important to make sure that you know which notices you're supposed to be providing, that you're providing them, and that if a participant makes a specific request, that you are responding to that promptly so that you don't incur any penalties for failure to provide that. So I'm going to end the general session now, but we're going to hang around to answer any questions that we have received. Again, you can submit those questions through the question box in the webinar, or to our email address at compliance@probenefits.com. Either way, we will respond to your questions and get back to you. As a reminder, we will be sending out a copy of the recording along with slides. And if you would like any of these resources, feel free to respond and let us know, and we will get those to you. Again, thank you so much for joining us. I know it's a busy time. I hope busy season is treating you all well, and that hopefully you get an opportunity to enjoy the beautiful weather that we've had so far. So if you're hopping off, again, thank you. If you're going to stick around, we will be answering questions. Feel free to submit those now if you haven't already. Thank you.